In Matthew 18, Jesus had something to say about how to handle conflict among believers. When someone sins against you, another Christian sins against you, if you're a Christian. See, Jesus expects us to deal with this in a godly way. His instructions in this chapter were given to his disciples, but they're very applicable still to us today. So let's look at it. In verse 15, he says this: if another believer sins against you, here's what you should do. Go privately and point out the offense. And if the other person listens and confesses it, you've won that person back. What a simple verse that is. How important it is for us to apply this verse in our churches, in our small groups, in our relationships with other believers. This is what Jesus said you should do. Memorize it, put it into practice. Then he goes on in verse 16. If you are unsuccessful, take one or two others with you and go back again so that everything you say may be confirmed by 2 or 3 witnesses. So this is what he says to do. If it doesn't work, if your authenticity, if you're approaching them in love and gently telling them in private that they've hurt you, they've sinned against you, that doesn't work, then go with 1 or 2 others and share it. He doesn't say just drop it. He says, no, you need to make sure you resolve this. Now look what he says in verse 17. If the person still refuses to listen, then take your case to the church. We'll talk about that in a second. And then finally he says at the end of verse 17, then if he or she won't accept the church's decision, treat that person as a pagan or a corrupt tax collector. Now let me tell you, bullet point what's going on here, and then you can talk about it as a small group. Here's what you should do, what Jesus says you should do when someone sins against you. Let's summarize. Number 1, talk to the person about it. Okay? Go to the person directly and talk to the person about it. Usually, hopefully, in a healthy relationship, that will take care of it. But if that doesn't work, involve 1 or 2 others, not 20 others, just 1 or 2 others who love that person like you love that person. That's what the Bible says. That's what Jesus says. If that doesn't work, get the appropriate leader at church or in your group or in your small group, maybe someone who's discipling that person, whatever. Get the appropriate spiritual leader involved in the situation. If that doesn't work, then the relationship is probably broken. Jesus says treat that person as a pagan or as a corrupt tax collector. Now, let me just finish with this. What not to do when someone sins against you. Here's what you shouldn't do. This is kind of inferred in what Jesus is saying. You shouldn't whine. You shouldn't complain. Just kind of sit there and whine and complain about it and just sulk about it. That's not what Jesus says to do. You shouldn't gossip. Gossiping is when you go to other people. Jesus doesn't say go to other people first. He says talk to the person about it first. This is the appropriate way to handle it when someone sins against you. And then you also don't bail on the friendship. Jesus doesn't say just write them off. Man, if they sin against you, get your feelings all hurt and write them off. That's not what you're supposed to do. Again, go back to the list of what you should do when someone sins against you. In fact, I'm going to pause it right on this. And as a small group, why don't you talk about this and whether you've ever done this before? Be challenged by this truth in Matthew 18.